Yeah.
I'm curious now.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to AMP's 10th educational webinar titled The Tide is Shifting, Palestine Solidarity in 2021. My name is Tarek Khalil, and I am the education coordinator for the American Muslims for Palestine. It's such an honor with us. It's such an honor to have with us a powerhouse panel for this important discussion. You know, we've really witnessed a shift in our political discourse vis-a-vis Palestine and Palestinian human rights. The conversation is slowly but surely shifting away from Israeli so-called security concerns to centering Palestinian rights, because more and more Americans are cognizant of the reality on the ground and see the situation for what it is. On one side, a settler colonial entity operating as an apartheid regime throughout all of historic Palestine, and on the other side, the colonized subjects. It's no longer anathema to invoke terms such as apartheid or settler colonialism as a descriptive framework for Israel's foundational structure and policies. In fact, some members of Congress have unapologetically used those terms. Various initiatives were taken by some courageous members of Congress that were unthinkable just a few years ago. In March of this year, 12 members of Congress sent a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken expressing concern over Israel's policy of demolishing Palestinian homes and requesting the State Department to undertake an investigation into Israel's possible use of U.S. equipment in violation of the Arms Export Control Act, and called on the State Department to condemn Israel's home demolitions. And another measure, 64 members of Congress sent another letter expressing concerns over Israel's ongoing transfer and home demolitions. And AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, also led a joint resolution with Congressman Rashida Tlaib to block a $735 million weapons sale to Israel. And also just a month ago, my Congresswoman here in the 3rd District led 24 of her colleagues in a letter emphasizing the centrality of international law and undergirding our country's foreign policy. And within that context, called upon the Biden administration to send a message to Israel to desist from its plans to demolish Palestinian homes in Silwan, my neighborhood, and removing Palestinians from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. And Representative Betty McCollum introduced H.R. 2590, defending the human rights of Palestinian children and families living under Israeli Military Occupation Act. And we'll talk more about that as the webinar moves forward. The point is this: Palestinian human rights is now front and center. And AMP has been a leading voice in providing resources and pushing for a real shift in policy. Our vigorous advocacy on Capitol Hill has reached new heights, and we are indeed witnessing the tide shifting. We thank those members of Congress who have the courage of their convictions and are at the forefront of the struggle for justice and liberation for Palestinians. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to wish everyone a happy Juneteenth, a day symbolizing the end of slavery in the United States. It is now a federal holiday, and the first federal holiday approved since Martin Luther King Day was established in 1983. Black people in this country are still in a struggle for justice and liberation, and we stand with them in their struggle. And now to our wonderful panel. We have with us Beth Miller, who is the Senior Government Affairs Manager for Jewish Voice for Peace Action, where she leads the organization's congressional advocacy and electoral organizing to build a U.S. foreign policy that supports human rights and equality for all Palestinians and Israelis. Before joining JVP, she served as the liaison to Jewish communities for the NYC Commission on Human Rights and worked as U.S. Advocacy Officer at Defense for Children International, Palestine, where she co-led the nationwide No Way to Treat a Child campaign. And we also have with us Omar Baddar, who is a Palestinian-American political analyst based in Washington, D.C., and a member of the National Policy Council of the Arab American Institute. Previously, he served as the Deputy Director of the Arab American Institute, Executive Director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee of Massachusetts and was a digital producer and presenter with Al Jazeera's The Stream. His media appearances include the BBC, MSNBC, Al Jazeera, and Sky News, among other outlets. And also we have joining us in about 25 to 30 minutes or so, Congresswoman Marie Newman, who represents the Illinois 3rd Congressional District, which covers the southwest side of Chicago as well as its surrounding suburbs. This area has the largest Palestinian Arab community in the country. A lifelong advocate for growing small businesses, protecting healthcare rights, strengthening our infrastructure, and building a greener economy. Congresswoman Newman is the first woman in history to represent Illinois' 3rd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. And now I want to start off with you, Beth, with this initial question, and I really want us to have a meaningful discussion on what is really taking place in these last few years, especially the last 2 to 3 years. Our political advocacy has come a long way over the last few years, but more particularly, I would say just in the last year or two. What do you make of this trend? And why do you think advocacy for Palestinian human rights is resonating with a growing number of people in the U.S.?
Yeah, thanks, Tarek, and thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this panel today. Very honored to be here. I think a lot of what you laid out before are perfect examples of this moment we're in, where we are seeing, it feels very much like we are in a tipping point moment, right? Where public opinion is finally kind of becoming aware of what is really happening in Palestine and what the Israeli government has been doing to Palestinians for decades and decades. And so, like you said, we're hearing people who are talking about apartheid, who are talking about settler colonialism, who are finally naming the reality as it actually is, which is something that should not be a very high bar, but as we know, is a high bar. And I think that there's a lot of reasons that we see this happening. But one of the things that I think is really, really interesting is that I see this as not only about Palestine, right? I think that there is a growing left in the US and a growing understanding more broadly across among many Americans of state violence and what systemic systems of oppression have looked like for so many people, both in this country and around the world, and the role that the US has played in that. And I think that that shift in understanding and that growing awareness has allowed for people to finally understand our relationship to the Israeli government and what the Israeli government has been doing in kind of a new way. I think that Trump and Netanyahu have played a big part in this, right? In kind of exposing what has always been present, right? Trump did not invent racism in this country, for example. Netanyahu did not invent racism in Israel, but they ripped back the Band-Aid and showed people who weren't able to see it before in an entirely new way. And so I think that that's also played a pretty big role in how people are viewing this now and what they're willing to do to take action for Palestinian rights and for Palestinian liberation. And that doesn't come out of nowhere. When we think about all these things that are moving over the last year or two, I think it's really important for us to remember that this is happening after decades of Palestinian-led movement organizing in this country and globally, right? At the local level, there have been so many in the Palestinian rights movement who've been showing up in solidarity with other movements in this country, right? So to be connecting the dots around why, if you are an anti-racist in the US and you are fighting for Black liberation, why it makes sense to also be an anti-Zionist and to be fighting for Palestinian liberation. And we see it playing out in Congress too, right? We see it playing out at the national level where Representative McCollum, who introduced HR 2590, which you mentioned in your introduction and I'll mention again in just a moment, she's been pushing bills that are similar to this for years, and they have not been getting much attention. And so the movement that has been pushing and advocating for those bills and for other initiatives led by other pro-Palestinian rights members of Congress for years and years, that momentum is picking up steam, and it allows for this moment we're in, where there's been all of this grassroots organizing work happening for so long, and now people are kind of able to pick it up and run with it in a more expanded way. And I think that what's really powerful about this moment is that we are seeing the ties between that local organizing and what it means for building power at the national level and in Congress. And so, one really powerful example of that comes to mind is Congresswoman Cori Bush. A few weeks ago now, in the middle of the Israeli military assault on Gaza, members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus took to the House floor for a special order hour where many members of Congress spoke out for Palestinian rights. And one of those members of Congress was Congresswoman Bush. And her speech focused specifically on organizing that she had been doing in Ferguson and with Palestinian activists in Ferguson, who had taught her about the fight for Palestinian liberation, and who had and the conversations that she had had in rooms with them, just talking about the connections between, for example, again, Black liberation and Palestinian liberation. And that hyper local organizing and solidarity is now in Congress. And now she is a member of Congress showing up, speaking on the House floor for Palestinian rights and naming apartheid and calling, fighting against apartheid and putting her name on bills and leading initiatives. And so we see the way that this local organizing really does amplify out and make a difference in the long haul power building that movements are doing in this country, and that the Palestinian rights movement is doing in this country. And so I think that history of organizing is so critical to this moment we're in, this shifting tide moment that we're in, where more and more people are becoming aware of what's going on and are ready to kind of push back against the Israeli government. And to kind of stay on this lane of Congress and the way that we see this playing out in Congress, it used to be not too long ago that you could count on one hand the number of representatives or members of Congress that you had who would really actually be calling for real accountability for the Israeli government, or real accountability for the US government, for that matter, and how we are complicit and supporting and defending everything that's happening. And that number is growing. You need more than one hand, you need more than two hands. We can reliably get an increasingly large number of members of Congress who will actually talk about the Israeli government's demolition of Palestinian homes, forced displacement of Palestinian families, military imprisonment of Palestinian children, theft of Palestinian land, and who not only will talk about it, and who will not only do things like express concern about it, which is what we so frequently see from so many members of the Democratic Party in particular, who will say that they're deeply concerned by X, Y, or Z, but won't actually do anything about it. Members of Congress who will actually put pen to paper, lead on initiatives and vehicles that are actually moving the needle toward real, tangible accountability and pressure to force the Israeli government to change its actions and to force the US government to stop being complicit in what the Israeli government is doing. And so, you mentioned these initiatives, these amazing letters that are really truly historic in what they do and what they talk about, right? This initiative led by Representatives Tlaib and Pocan, a letter to Secretary Blinken from a few months ago, that named settler colonialism as being part of the Israeli government's settlement expansion. That is historic, and that is major, and that is, again, it's not inconsequential that these members of Congress are willing to name that reality. It does matter, and it does make a difference. And then, of course, we also see other historic measures that happen and move very quickly. So, for example, when, again, during Israel's most recent military assault on Gaza, when the news broke that the Biden administration had approved a $735 million weapon sale to the Israeli government, and that those were the exact weapons that the Israeli government was using to bomb Palestinians in Gaza and wipe out families and bomb roads to hospitals, that we had Representative Ocasio-Cortez in the House and Senator Sanders in the Senate leading the first ever joint resolutions of disapproval on a weapon sale to Israel is, I'll tell you the truth, is that up until a few days before it happened, I didn't think it would happen. I really didn't. I was like, Congress will never actually do this. And they did. And not only did they, but in the House, Representative Ocasio-Cortez had 14 other members of Congress who stood with her in that initiative. And again, it's one of those things where, that number is small when you put it in comparison to the whole, like the full Congress, the full number of members of Congress. But it's huge when you think about the path we are building, and the fact that that number is going to keep growing faster and faster and faster and faster. And it is becoming more clear to these members of Congress that the train is leaving the station fast for them to be on the right side of history. And either they come out now in support of actually conditioning and cutting our military funding and stopping the weapon sales that are going to the Israeli government to be used by an apartheid regime to kill Palestinians, Now is the time. They have to speak out at it now. And we're seeing that increasingly happen and increasingly take place. And so I think that that's the direction the tide is heading in. That's kind of how it looks and plays out in Congress. And the last thing I'll say, just to kind of wrap these thoughts, is that we can't take any of this as a given, right? The tide is shifting. People are increasingly, the grassroots is with us. The Democratic base is with us. The progressive movement is fully with us, right? But we have to keep pushing in Congress, because the fact that we are getting closer and closer on this means that anti-Palestinian groups are pushing back harder too, right? We all saw how Congresswoman Omar, for example, was so intensely attacked after she asked Secretary Blinken a question about justice for Palestinian victims of Israeli war crimes, and for talking about war crimes that were committed by the Israeli government and the US government. That, she was threatened with being stripped of her committee assignments. It's not a small thing that they are going after her like this. And we see attempts to legislate and codify weaponized, dangerous definitions of anti-Semitism that try to conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of the Israeli government, or with anti-Zionism, which is simply not true. But these things are picking up steam as well, right? Because we are getting closer, we are shifting, we are gaining grassroots movement power. And so anti-Palestinian groups are pushing back just as hard. And so it means that we have to double down and keep organizing even more than we were before, because this is the moment when we push harder to move forward even more. And being in this post-Trump era, living under the Biden administration, we can keep pushing, and we can show that the Palestinian rights movement is one part of the broader progressive wing of this party, right? What happened in May when Biden said what most US presidents would have said, which was basically completely supporting the Israeli government's assault on Gaza, and demolition of homes or threatened of evictions of Palestinian families in Jerusalem. He did what US presidents often do, always do. And the fact that that was a wedge breaking point between him and the progressive wing of his party is huge. And again, just shows that this is not just the Palestinian rights movement fighting this fight anymore. There is the progressive movement that understands that Palestinian rights are one core issue in the broader movement, and that we can be growing that wedge in the party to show that if you are a progressive, you are a progressive on Palestine too. There's no such thing as progressive except for Palestine. There never really has been. And increasingly, that is a political reality that is being understood in DC as well.
Wow, thank you so much, Beth. And I agree. There's 27 co-sponsors now to HR 2590, but just 2 weeks ago or somewhere around there, it was only 24. And before that, so I want to look at the positive trajectory here. There should be 435 co-sponsors, but we'll take what we get. Almost same question to you. What do you make of this new discourse that we're seeing? And it's no longer an ugly word to say apartheid or Israeli apartheid. Please expound on that.
Thank you so much, Tarek, and thank you to AMP for putting this event together. And I'm really glad to be sharing this panel actually with Beth as well, who's really a tough act to follow. I mean, not only is JVP really a serious force in advocacy for Palestinian rights, but Beth herself is really one of the smartest advocates who I think is making a meaningful contribution to the progress that we're working together on. I think you're right. We have made tremendous progress. This is a massive moment for the struggle for Palestinian rights in the United States. When you think about the fact that previous administrations, sometimes they would have meetings with community leaders, but really when it came to moments of the massive assaults that would take place targeting Gaza, for example, there would always be a few hundred of us standing outside of the White House with our signs, but there would still be a feeling of deep frustration that the people inside aren't really hearing us. And in 2014, and to say that in the next major Israeli assault on Gaza, that there would be member of Congress after member of Congress taking to the House floor, denouncing Israeli violence against Palestinians and denouncing apartheid. And if you said that there would be a Palestinian-American member of Congress who is directly confronting the president to say what you're doing is not good enough, that really would have seemed unbelievable. I mean, this is a big moment, and this is a time when, really, to zoom out a little bit, it's also a time when a really powerful member of Congress like Eliot Engel, who is a force for regressive policy, was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee and was deeply supported by the so-called Israel lobby, the lobby that advocates for whatever Israeli policies happen to be. That seemed like an unmovable force. And the fact that he was unseated by Jamal Bowman, a newcomer who was very outspoken about Palestinian human rights, broke the mythology, the idea that you cannot be critical of Israel or to challenge the Israel lobby and have a political career in the United States. And that reality that we live in now, where that mythology about the unbelievable power of the Israel lobby being broken, is what creates these moments, is what creates an opening for members of Congress like Congressman Newman, who I know is going to be speaking in a few minutes, who was one of the first to criticize Israel for not meeting its obligation of providing COVID vaccines to Palestinians who are living under occupation, was one of the original co-sponsors of the Betty McCollum legislation that Beth was just talking about, and who recently led a letter to Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, insisting that he apply pressure on Israel to halt the expulsion of Palestinians from their homes in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. She, of course, also has shown courage in fighting for healthcare, for economic justice, LGBTQ rights, and she has stood firm in the face of massive backlash that she has gotten for supporting Palestinian human rights. So she certainly is not afraid to speak truth to power, but also it's an indication of the moment that we're in right now, where people now give each other courage and say that we can speak the truth about what's happening in Palestine. We can do it boldly and unapologetically, and that we can see that this is actually rewarding at this point politically, rather than being a huge liability as it's often been portrayed. I think there are many reasons for this moment being where it is. I think Beth is absolutely correct in the many things that she's outlined about it. Another one being really the fact that the diversity of the American Jewish community is now on full display. There was a time when AIPAC pretended to be speaking for the entire American Jewish community, and now we see the emergence of JVP as a major force. We see the emergence of other organizations like If Not Now, and then maybe even centrist organizations like J Street, whose politics might not be perfect, but at least have busted the mythology that AIPAC speaks for the American Jewish community. I think that created a massive political opening for a member of Congress to be willing to criticize Israeli policy and still be resistant to accusations of anti-Semitism that are often leveled as smears targeting people who are outspoken on this. I think another issue is the emergence of Donald Trump was a hugely destructive force in terms of the actual policies that were implemented, both domestically in the United States and in foreign policy towards Palestine and Israel. But it also created a more honest look at what Israel was carrying out, because Israel saw the emergence of Donald Trump as an opening in which they no longer had to pretend to call for a Palestinian state or for a peace process or all that nonsense. They knew it was nonsense. We knew it was nonsense. But they felt that they no longer had to keep up that pretense because Donald Trump was embracing of whatever Netanyahu wanted to do. And that has made the reality of what Israel is doing to Palestinians all the more blatant and more difficult to deny. And it's put defenders of Israeli apartheid on the defensive because they no longer have a winning argument. And I think, of course, the emergence of Black Palestine solidarity as a major force is also a huge contributing factor, which is in a way tied to the Trump era. Obviously, Black Palestine solidarity dates back all the way to the 80s. During the Jesse Jackson campaign, there was a plank for support for Palestinian rights. And we saw the rebirth of that solidarity during Ferguson. But really, it was during the Trump era, and it was the absolutely horrific murder of George Floyd on camera that really galvanized massive energy in this country to fight for Black lives being recognized and valued. And through that, we saw the reemergence of Black Palestine solidarity and the recognition of how connected and interconnected these struggles are for justice and equality everywhere in the world. And I think that that's essentially the reason why we are witnessing the moment we're witnessing, because ultimately, I think everybody has an innate desire for fairness, and everybody's naturally aggravated by unfairness. When we see people not being treated correctly, I think anybody looking at that situation would want that corrected. And all you needed to know is for people to understand, to hear the story of Palestine, to come to the correct position on it. And we've seen literally at this point a couple of decades of really impressive work of Palestinian activists and our allies trying to get the word out and trying to correct the narrative. And I think that has been absolutely, has really paid off in a very, very serious way in terms of public opinion now, showing that people have a much deeper understanding, certainly on the progressive side of American politics and the populace. The younger generation, the more diverse communities have a much deeper understanding of the injustice that Israel imposes on Palestinians. And I think that moving forward, we can only expect this to become more and more blatant, and for the demands for a shift in American policy to get louder, because we are looking at a situation in which Palestinians are denied the most fundamental levels of freedom. They live under occupation without rights, and many live within Israel as second-class citizens with some rights, but still obviously oppressed and treated unequally in ways that are intolerable. And you have refugees who can't return to their homes. This is not a situation that is okay. And this reversing of oppressor and oppressed that has long dominated discourse has finally been undone. But I also, at the same time, would not want to get carried away and say that victory at this point is inevitable, because it is not. Beth correctly noted that at this point, there is a much more significant fight on the other side. Our opponents are becoming more aggressive. And I do think that in some way, that is a positive sign. There's a quote that is often attributed to Gandhi, but it's actually not his, although I don't know who it actually belongs to, that says, first, they ignore you, then they laugh at you, and then they fight you, and then you win. And seeing how aggressive the other side is getting is a sign of the fact that we have made tremendous progress in our narrative sticking. And as Israel's violence and racism and oppression become more and more blatant, it becomes more and more difficult for the other side to defend it on merits. And that is why they resort to these tactics of trying to suppress free speech on the issue of Palestine, willing to undermine Americans' constitutional rights for the sake of restricting criticism of Israel, because they know that they no longer have a winning case. And that's why we end up in this situation where even massive civil rights organizations like the ACLU, who have no interest in American foreign policy, weighing in against the Israel lobby's efforts to suppress the First Amendment in order to shield Israel from criticism. That, in a way, I think is a very, very massive moment. But we cannot be triumphalists, and we cannot pretend that we are on the verge of victory, because we're not quite on the verge of victory here. We have to remember that the majority of people in Congress are still either silent on Israeli apartheid or are apologists for that apartheid. So we have a very long way to go. And we can't forget the fact that Palestinians living on the ground are still facing a really ugly and deteriorating situation, where they are within the reach of Israeli violence on a daily basis, no matter where they may be. They could be getting shot at in the West Bank, or having bombs dropped in their homes in Gaza, or having mobs in the streets attacking them within 48. This is an intolerable reality, and it's still a very, very ugly and dangerous one that certainly has every prospect of escalating as we succeed in shifting the discourse in a more positive direction here. People will suffer the consequences of that on the ground. And so the last thing I would say about sort of a call for the movement for Palestinian rights everywhere, I think it's important for us to be very serious, very dedicated, and very strategic. And I think that there is a small segment of people within this movement who think of themselves as advocates for Palestinian human rights, but who are quick to make enemies over minor disagreements with other people in this movement. And in my view, that is not a serious effort to challenge the fundamental reality that we live in if we pursue that policy, because ultimately we can only win this fight if we build a broad movement. And so we have to be a movement that embraces diversity of thought. We certainly not only can, but have to and should be able to debate vigorously different strategic options and positions and everything, but still do it with the spirit where our eye is always on the ball, and the ball is fighting to free Palestinians from oppression and apartheid. And I'm certain that even though we are not quite close enough to really taste victory, we're not quite that close, but there is every reason from everything that we have described so far to say that it is really a promising situation, and there is every sign of hope that if we come together and we really fight like hell in a very serious, strategic, and dedicated way, that we can ultimately achieve freedom for Palestinians.
No, I really want to thank you both for, emphasizing the intersectional element and specifically the Black Palestinian transnational solidarity. And thank you, Omar, especially for emphasizing that this new trend in Black Palestinian transnational solidarity is a resurgence. It's not the beginning. I mean, it happened decades before. So this is something that's very crucial as we continue our activism. I really want to, I want to get into the political weeds for just a minute. Zionist zealots and organizations fear that Israel will become, a healthcare issue. That is to say, a partisan one where Democrats and Republicans are fighting it out, a really divisive issue. And they fear losing the bipartisan support that has been the bedrock of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel for decades. Members of Congress are calling for conditioning aid, which was unthinkable, not even a decade ago. My question is, are we in that bipartisan divide moment right now? And anybody can tackle this. Beth, go ahead. I'll call it.
It's a really good question. I think it is increasingly becoming a partisan issue. It makes sense to me that Zionist groups, anti-Palestinian groups are really afraid of it becoming a partisan issue. It's becoming a partisan issue, but I think within that, it's also a rupture within the Democratic Party too, right? Like Omar said, we are not there yet, right? Like the full Democratic Party is not with us yet. We still have a long way to build. And so I think that the reality is that it's about values, right? And values translate into your political party often. And then within that, there are debates there too. If you are someone who believes that all people, no exceptions, deserve to live in freedom, deserve to live under equality, deserve to live with full rights and dignity and justice, then you support Palestinian rights. And there is a rapidly growing base within the Democratic Party that believes that, and that is gaining power within the Democratic Party and is pushing back against this idea that, actually only some people deserve those things. And so that's growing rapidly. And so I think that I would personally say that where we're at now is that, yes, it's definitely a partisan issue, right? Like, for example, Republicans we do not have Republican support on Betty McCollum's bill. And I do not anticipate that we will have Republican support on Betty McCollum's bill. But then within that, there is also a break within the Democratic Party. And that's where we start, and we build that power within the Democratic Party first. I will just say that the piece of it that I think is really partisan. Hi, Congresswoman.
How is everyone?
Everyone's doing fine. We're just in the little bit of a quick Q&A here, but I'm so glad that you made the time for us today. And Beth, I really want you to finish your point, and then we'll get Congressman Newman. And go ahead, please.
Congresswoman, you joined us just for the political weeds question, so great timing on your part. So I'll just wrap this thought by saying that, one piece that is really partisan that we're really seeing is that Republicans are trying to drag the goalpost right. We're to the right. We're seeing that, for example, they're trying to politicize something as basic as humanitarian aid to Gaza, which was not always politicized. Humanitarian aid should be the most basic, easy thing to send anywhere. And now the Republican Party is trying to make it seem like that's where the fight is, right? You have to fight to even send humanitarian aid. And so I think the challenge becomes then making sure that the Democrats don't lose sight of the fact that that's not actually where the fight is. Like, we have to fight that fight. We need to send humanitarian aid, but that is a bare minimum Band-Aid. We also have to address the root causes. And so Republicans are trying to politicize in that way and make it seem like humanitarian aid is a fight as well, as an example. And so I think it's important that we, I think, Omar, you said this, right? Like, keep your eye on the ball, keep your eye on the prize, which is Palestinian freedom, rights and equality for all people. And so just to note that I do think there are ways in which this is increasingly becoming a partisan issue, and it is still an intra-Democratic Party conversation as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I really thank you for taking the time, Congressman Newman. I know you have a tight schedule and you have a lot going today. So I really appreciate you making the time. You really are a breath of fresh air. And what makes you extra special is that you are really a proud leader in the pro-justice, pro-peace movement. I mean, you were just Omar actually said this earlier. You were the first to speak up against the disparities in COVID-19 vaccinations for the Palestinian people. You were one of the first co-sponsors for the Betty McCollum HR 2590 bill, and you spearheaded one of the most powerful letters to the State Department to denounce Israel's theft of homes in Sheikh Jarrah and the demolition of Palestinian homes in Sidwan. This letter holds Israel accountable. And you're a leader in the movement for global peace and justice, and you stand in solidarity with all marginalized communities. I really do appreciate you being on and you fighting the fight the way that you do. I really want you to speak to why is it so easy for you, to stand for what is right and what is just, but why is it so hard for others, your colleagues, to do something that's so basic as to support justice, to support humanitarian aid, to support just doing what's right, something that should be basic and should be instant. Please speak to that, and also speak to this shifting tide that we're seeing in Congress and everything else, please.
It's about the coalition we've built, and it isn't really about me being tough or brave or any of those things. It's about what my team, my community has built, is that they have stretched out their arms to all types of folks. In my coalition are groups that pro-Palestinian folks may not be super fond of. In my coalition are folks that come from all different places to come together on humanitarian rights. So to say that I'm brave or tough or any of those things is really a misnomer. It's really that this coalition is doing what they feel is right collectively, that it is the moral thing to do, it is the right thing to do. So while, I get death threats, I get, all different kinds of threats all the time. People say that I don't go far enough. I mean, there's no winning this game in any way. However, when your North Star is always doing the right things. And when I see something as basic as home theft, and that's what Sheikh Jarrah and some of the other areas have been suffering from, it's home expulsions and this constant bullying and intimidation and expelling from homes and all of this, that's just home theft. Like anybody on the planet that has a conscience or a soul knows that home theft is wrong. And so when you make it that basic, no one can say, wow, that's wrong, Marie. That's wrong. No, actually, everybody agrees home theft is wrong. Abusing people is wrong. Using aid from one country to hurt another country is wrong. So while I am sure that people that don't feel as strongly as I do and have not perhaps made the overtures that myself and my coalition have made, they get death threats too, and they've gotten bullied and they've all those things. It's just a matter of, pushing through. So the good news is that we are a coalition here in Illinois, 3 of Muslims, all Arab Americans, Southeast Asian Muslims, progressives, Irish Americans, Polish Americans, Latino Americans, and Asian Americans. We are all a coalition. And what we all believe is that humanitarian rights are important. So this is just a matter of doing the moral thing. It's not about being tough or brave.
I mean, I appreciate the humility, Congresswoman, but I really do think that you are definitely a brave and courageous voice on Capitol Hill. And I really do appreciate the fact that you do speak out and you do speak truth to power, and it's really a blessing to have you. And Omar, I really wanted you to respond to the question that I asked regarding this bipartisan divide that we're seeing vis-a-vis the topic of Israel-Palestine, please.
First, let me echo your feeling that I do think that Congresswoman Marie Newman is incredibly courageous. There's this quote by FDR that says, courage is not the absence of fear, but the realization that something is more important than the threat that you face, and to essentially defy the fear that you're feeling. And that's precisely what we witness here, in that advocating for justice should not result in death threats. And the fact that people who advocate for basic justice do receive that is really an intolerable situation. But that's precisely what makes people who are insisting on fighting for what's right on this topic really so courageous. So thank you so much, Congresswoman. I really deeply appreciate your stance on all of this. On the partisan divide issue, I just think that it's worth noting that there's nothing inherently partisan about this particular issue. If your politics are libertarian or if you have conservative family values, none of this means that you therefore would be in favor of supporting apartheid abroad and supporting an American foreign policy in which we send money and weapons to people who are committing human rights abuses. So there is something unfortunate that has happened, and I think it has escalated really since 9/11 in particular, where the GOP has increasingly embraced the politics of bigotry to some degree, in which they've used really Islamophobia and all kinds of other bigotries towards immigrant communities and people who are coming in from south of the border and everything else. And that became a political tool for them. And I think that really pushed the GOP in a very destructive direction. And the emergence of Donald Trump, of course, is a chicken or egg situation. Donald Trump succeeded because of where the GOP was, and then the GOP is becoming worse specifically because of the Trumpization of the party now after his presidency. So we are in a situation where I think this issue is becoming more and more partisan, and for the foreseeable future, there is every reason to expect it to continue to be partisan, in which you have one side of the aisle that is increasingly embracing of progressive values and values of equality and freedom and justice, and another side that is lost really in a really dark place. But eventually, one can imagine a situation in which the political landscape changes, and there should be absolutely no reason to completely give up in the long term on the idea that people who are on the other side of this aisle would ultimately be also in favor of a more just and equitable foreign policy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just we've been living in a, I mean, at least during my time in my activism, I haven't seen this type of rhetoric, used in Congress, and I had no faith years ago. But knowing that there are people out there like Congressman Newman who do seek political office and will do what is right really does give me a lot of hope, and I'm very, very hopeful for the future, and that really does reignite my activism and also in my belief. But I want to talk about the grassroots movements element, such as AMP and JVP and others, of course. They've really provided mobilization tools and a foundation from which to advocate for Palestinian rights. The gap in strength between that mobilization and AIPAC, for instance, or other pro-Israel lobby groups is not as wide as it used to be. Can you speak to that element in this ever-changing discourse that we're witnessing today? I'll have Beth, you go. You haven't spoken in a while.
Absolutely. I think, groups like JVP, groups like AMP, we are what you just said, which is grassroots movement organizations, right? Which means that we operate bottom up. And our theory of change, our belief is that the way we change Congress is by changing what all people in this country think, right? We start in community. We start by actually talking to the people around us. And then we use that to build political power that influences Congress. That's the way we operate. And so it is true that our grassroots groups, pro-Palestinian groups, are gaining power and gaining strength in a way that is closing that gap with anti-Palestinian groups like AIPAC, for example, that you mentioned. But the reason is because of organizing, and it's because we are reflective of what public opinion looks like, right? We are reflective of a growing progressive movement. We are reflective of a growing left in this country. We are not outside of it. And so any grassroots Palestinian rights groups that are gaining power, strength, size, that's happening because it reflects a shift in public opinion in this country more broadly. And I do strongly believe that then does translate up. It translates into Congress. And I would love to hear, Congresswoman Newman, your thoughts on this particular from your perspective of how you hear that or see that or experience it. But just to say that I think grassroots movement gaining power, what that means is public opinion is shifting, and that's the way we change things for the long haul.
And I think Beth is 100% right. I think that the reason we hear broadcasters, network anchors, and reporters using words like apartheid and occupation is because all of those grassroots groups have done such phenomenal work. And they've been doing it for 30 years, but it has really taken root in the last 30 just by sheer critical mass that we have now. So I think Beth is 100% right. I would say yes, and. So the and is that I would like to see all those phenomenal groups spend even a quarter of the time that they do on Congress, on the Senate, and on the administration. And this is one of the things where everybody gets a little frustrated with me, but I'm going to say it. I'm going to keep saying it. I'm going to keep saying it louder. You must get senators on your bus, and you have to start shifting, because just remember, Congress only has a purse. So the U.S. House of Representatives only has the purse. We don't have the power of policy, foreign policy. And until you get to senators and the administration and get them to move, which you can do through public opinion, right? So keep that pressure on. But you've really got to you kind of punched our doors in the House of Representatives. You got to do it harder and more and better in the Senate and in the policy centers, like in Secretary Blinken's office. And I know they're giving you the cold shoulder, so I get it. But you guys got the cold shoulder from all members of Congress too. So I know you can do it. So I'm just saying you've got to start shifting resources to the Senate and to the administration vigorously and with vortigration. What I mean by that is laterally and longitudinally.
And I think that, using what has been done in Congress as kind of like a start, as a foundation to build on. And I really want you to speak to the letter. I mean, your letter. I mean, you talked about my neighborhood as well, Silwan. I mean, just in a matter of days, 1,500 people could lose their homes because of a bureaucratic Zionistic permit regime that is now invoked to demolish the homes of these families that are indigenous to that land. And I mean, we have to move quickly. I understand that it's a more difficult and long process, because you have two branches within the legislature. You have two houses within the legislative branch. You have the executive branch that's still married to the status quo. And I just feel like that while it is hard, I do like where we're at the moment.
Yeah.
But when these things are imminent, just like the demolitions in Silwan, letters like yours can be very, very significant. Can you just talk about? I just want you to briefly, and then we'll get to Omar. Please talk about that.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Do you want to go to me or Omar?
No, you, and then we'll get to Omar. I don't know. You have time constraints.
So I think the letters do help. And I think it's the aggregate force of everything we just shared, is that it is the grassroots that Beth talked about. It is, pounding down doors, metaphorically, with members of Congress, but really shifting resources to the Senate and to the administration, and asking senators. The other thing that is a great tool in our toolbox are donors. I would like to see a very strategic effort by AMP and some of the coalitions out there. Here in Chicago, we have the Palestinian Coalition Network, that is a bunch of different organizations, JVP, and all of the rock star organizations that have a grassroots force. I would like to see them start putting real pressure on donors of Democratic senators. That is very powerful. And that's the one place I would say, and it's not a criticism, that I would spend a lot of time on. So I would go to the folks at AADIF and some of these other large organizations and say, you need to start reaching out to the donors that support all of these senators, Democratic senators, and say, look, times are changing. These humanitarian rights violations have only gotten worse decade after decade after decade, and the unfairness has only gotten worse. We need to have a safe, peaceful place for everybody to live. You must act. But it's the one area that I don't think anyone's working on, and I think that's your secret sauce.
Yeah, I honestly think that's really spot on. And it's important to know that when we're talking about this administration and many other administrations, there's two things happening, right? One is lack of accurate information, and one is lack of sufficient political pressure. And those are useful to think about a little bit separately, because the political pressure part is absolutely straightforward. They need to hear from people. They need to feel the push in order for them to shift their policy. And we saw that especially with this latest assault on Gaza, where Biden had one tune at the beginning. President Biden had one tune at the very beginning, and then a very different one towards the end, after members of Congress were very vocal, after the conversation with Rashida Tlaib. Those things do make a difference. But the information part is also critical, because many times administration officials hear about what Israel is doing through a filter. You have Israeli diplomats who put a very different narrative on what Israel is carrying out. You have people who talk about this as a real estate dispute of what was happening, and no, this is just a legal case and the court will handle it. But then you have other Israeli leaders who speak much more bluntly and honestly about what is unfolding. You have the deputy mayor of Jerusalem, Aryeh King, who says the goal of the policy in East Jerusalem is to reduce the number of Palestinians and increase the number of Israeli Jews, because we want to have demographic dominance in East Jerusalem. And I think it becomes important to make sure that the voices that are speaking more honestly, that are showing the ugly face of actual policy as it is unfolding on the ground, are the ones that actually make it through to the administration. And I think that that's where direct advocacy matters. I hear a lot of people who are often dismissive of nothing good could ever come from this administration. They just don't really care, and they're not invested in this or that. But ultimately, a more accurate flow of information does make a difference. Ultimately, every administration is made up of human beings. And when people see the extent of the unfairness and injustice that is unfolding, coupled with the political pressure that we can build, I think those can lead to a real change in policy. Probably in very small ways in the short term, but at least it's the beginning of something that could hopefully snowball one day into a major shift in policy, so that the U.S. does not foot the bill anymore for Israeli apartheid.
Omar, I want to put a bit of information on top of that will make this very salient and important for our grassroots activists. In my lifetime, and I'm in my 50s, I have never seen a more empathetic leader than Joe Biden, maybe tied with Barack Obama. They're probably tied, which is why they were good friends, or are good friends. But as much as he is misinformed right now, and I do believe he's misinformed, I think you have a real opportunity with the Biden administration right now, because he is a very empathetic leader, and you don't get those always. We could get, the next time we have a Democratic president, it might be someone who's super wonky, right? So I'm just saying again, strike while the iron is hot, and you have momentum now. Get to your senators and get to this administration. And it means calling them every day. And it's all the things you guys do great, right? You all do this really, really well. Calling campaigns and email campaigns and letter campaigns and all of that. But it's really you've got to start working with the administration, and you're going to have to kick your way in. I hate to tell you that, because I can call the administration, Rashida, Ilhan, Betty, everybody can keep calling, but until voters call, voters are much more powerful in many ways. I'll keep doing whatever you guys need me to do. I am here, I'm your partner. But until the grassroots gets to the Joe Biden administration and to key senators, it's just not going to happen. And I can't say that more bluntly than I have. I'm so sorry, I do have to leave, but thank you for all of your good work, and strike while the iron's hot, and take this momentum forward. And thank you all for your great work.
Congressman Newman, we thank you very, very much, and I'm honored to live in this district now more than ever. So
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, have a good day, guys.
All right.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Congressman Newman touched on, a lot of the political strategizing that can get us to where we need to get to. I do think that it's important for us to pick up on these symbolic measures. These dear colleague letters, while they may not be binding, it's not law, but it's a great educational moment for the public to know, hey, there are members in Congress that are addressing an issue. What is this all about? And I think we can really pick up steam from that. But she said something, and I want to hear both of you comment on it, about the Biden administration and him being, empathetic, and we should really not give up. And while he did revert back to the status quo, he just all he really did so far was just he undid some of Trump's wonky policies. He reissued funding to UNRWA. He removed the ICC prosecutorial officials from the sanctions list. I mean, these are things that were not part of the status quo anyway. So, but he did revert back to the status quo. So can you please speak to her position and what she said vis-a-vis Joe Biden and the executive branch? And Omar, you can start with that.
Sure. Look, I think that it is correct to say that we've had a problem with American policy long before the Trump administration came on board. There was a fundamental contradiction in the US saying it opposes occupation, opposes settlements, believes in human rights. But American policy in practice was always to ensure that Israel has unconditional military funding and unconditional diplomatic protection to carry out whatever policies it wanted. Trump came along and resolved that contradiction in the wrong direction. Instead of shifting American policy to match the American position, he shifted the American position to match the policy and made it even much worse. He escalated the war against Palestinians, became a full participant in it instead of just simply being an enabler of it. And what we see with Biden is primarily basically a return to pre-Trump policy, which is a return to the fundamental contradiction that existed before. And that is not good enough. I don't want to play down the significance of some of the things that were reversed. Renewing funding to UNRWA is a very significant thing because very vulnerable people depend on that funding. And so we're making a difference in the lives of real vulnerable people. So that's a very real thing, but it still puts us back in a position where we are still ultimately providing aid to people who are victims of Israeli oppression while we spend much more money funding that Israeli oppression. That is just an unbelievably stupid policy right on its face. Even if you leave the morality of it aside, you're spending money supporting oppression and then spending money on the victims to assist them survive that oppression. And ultimately, it's something that has been said by many Palestinians for a long time. Palestinians are not victims of some natural disaster who are in need of charity. They are victims of oppression who need their freedom. And our role should be to end American support for the oppression that they live under. That should be the bare minimum. And that's really what we should be fighting for. But I do think that it's fair to say that we should not give up on the Biden administration. I know that there were a lot of people who were upset at a meeting that happened between some Palestinian-American leaders with the Biden administration. I was not one of the people who are upset at the fact that that meeting happened, but it should have been a much bigger and more inclusive meeting. There are so many people who I can think of who should have been at a meeting like that, should have been invited at least to a meeting like that, and they can make the decision of whether they want to attend or not, because ultimately we have boycotting our own government is not really an option as far as I'm concerned. They are using our money to carry out horrible policies, and every opportunity that we have to sit down with them and tell them to their faces that this policy is unacceptable, immoral, and that we demand something different, I think is an opportunity that we should take up. And the fact that, as disappointed as I am with the Biden administration on so many fronts, believe me, I'm not going to sing them any praises. We clearly saw a change from the Biden administration at the very beginning saying, we support Israel, it's only defending itself and not doing anything wrong, to a solid week of pressure from members of Congress and progressives, to Biden then insisting on calling for an immediate de-escalation and telling Netanyahu he expects an immediate ceasefire and whatever else. Obviously, this is still stands significantly short of what we would like to get, but it's still progress, and I think progress that we should take the opportunity to push for in every moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, yes, I think we have to keep pushing. And I think that, what the Congresswoman was saying, I think, Omar, what you're saying is we have a huge toolbox, right? As organizers and as activists, we have a toolbox that is filled with many different tools, and everyone is using different tools in different ways to get to the end result, which is, again, Palestinian liberation, and also specifically an end to US complicity in Israeli apartheid and an end to US support for Israeli apartheid. And so, we heard this over and over again during the election. Biden is a better target, right? Like, I don't know about you all, my belief, broadly speaking, with elections is that you are electing the person who you want to be the target of your organizing. That's what you're doing. You're electing the person that you think you can push.
Electing your opponent, effectively.
Exactly. You're electing your opponent. And so I have been incredibly disappointed with the Biden administration. Well, maybe disappointed isn't the right word. I think everything he's done, we knew he was going to do, but I've been very upset with the Biden administration and not surprised. Like you said, he has, I think, it's worth mentioning what the Biden administration has come in, and I think knowingly built out a narrative that says that Palestinians don't have a venue to seek justice, right? They're like, no, you can't go to the International Criminal Court. No, you can't boycott. No, you shouldn't protest. they're just kind of no, you shouldn't go to the Human Rights Council. No, you shouldn't go to the UN Security Council. And so, the Biden administration is an opponent. I think that is very true, and that you organize against your opponent. So, right, we can never just lean back and say, oh, Biden is the worst, we're never going to move Biden. It's okay, Biden is the worst, let's go in. Like, let's organize hard, and let's use every tool at our disposal to move him. And I personally feel that my understanding of Biden is that he ideologically is very supportive of the Israeli government's project. And so, and there's a point at which his personal ideology is only going to matter so much, because the political reality will be more important. And again, I think this ties into what we were saying at the beginning, which is that this is the Palestinian rights movement pushing Biden, but we are a part of a broader progressive left that views Biden as their opponent, and they views him as someone that they elected to be their opponent, right? We see Sunrise Movement increasingly escalating their tactics to push and move Biden around climate and infrastructure packages, and including addressing climate change there. And, we are part of that. And I think that it's critical that we remember that. And we remember that Biden is our opponent. Biden is an organizing target, and that's how we should approach him. And that means we keep pushing. I feel very similarly about the Senate and about senators, right? I think it's worth mentioning that Senator Chuck Schumer, for example, who is a stalwart hawk in support of horrible Israeli government policies, was notably almost silent during Israel's military assault on Gaza in May. And silence, we know silence is not enough, right? Silence is in support of the oppressor. We know this. And to take someone who is going from cheerleading military assaults to quiet on military assaults, that is reflective of the fact that he is terrified of the growing progressive left in this country that is also going to be pushing targets like Biden. If I can add just one quick thought, circling back to one other point you made, Tarek, about congressional letters, just very, very quickly, I just want to note that I think that letters are incredible opportunities and education moments, and they are important symbolic vehicles when they have the right content in them, right? So the reason that Congresswoman Newman's letter was important was because it included a paved pathway for concrete accountability, right? It talked about the ICC, it talked about potential violations of the Arms Export and Control Act. It wasn't just a letter. There are a lot of letters that are basically saying, we don't support annexation and we're really worried that it might happen. I don't think those letters are important, powerful tools. In fact, I don't support those letters. The letters that are important are the ones that say, this is wrong, here's why it's wrong, and we need to realize that we need to do something about it, and here's what we could do. And those are the letters that we're increasingly seeing coming forward from Representative Newman, Representative Tlaib, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, et cetera, et cetera. And those letters, even if they are not binding, those are the ones that are really important to moving the conversation, because the point that needs to move is not just, ooh, this is bad. It's, ooh, this is bad and we're involved and we need to change that. And I think that that's the piece that really makes the letter a powerful symbolic vehicle as well.
Yeah, and I've always been a fan of the political space argument. Okay, Biden is in, at least we'll have a little bit more space to organize. Obviously we know what he'll put on the table, but at least we'll have more space to actually put together a force that can really create real policy change. I've noticed something here, and I want you to speak to it. Corporate media no longer has a monopoly on the news. With the rise of social media and other outlets, I really feel like that, the general public has easy access to information, and I believe that's contributing to this shifting tide. Can you speak to that dichotomy? Do you see this becoming, creating an even bigger push down the line? The more social media grows in its impact, and how you believe that can actually influence change. Omar, go ahead.
Sure. Look, first, thank you, Beth, for putting more eloquently what I was trying to say earlier with Biden. I think describing him as an opponent is really the perfect way to describe it. Just of the fact that we are working against someone at the end of the day, but at least someone who can theoretically be moved, as opposed to Trump, who was an all-out enemy who was deeply committed to just aggravating you at every turn. there would be no point in trying to apply pressure, because the pressure is only, for somebody like Trump, would have been an indication that he's doing the right thing by just pissing you off more, if I can put it that bluntly. But look, on the question of social media, I think that is certainly the democratization of the flow of information has been huge. It's been very, very positive in the large scheme of things. It's not cost-free. It gave room for people like, what's his name? Crazy conspiracy theorist who got kicked off of YouTube and Twitter. I'm trying to remember now. Alex Jones. So, right, the democratization of information means people like him can also build a following. So that's a scary thing, that the concept of truth and reliable information dies off a little bit, but at least we don't only hear what corporate news want us to hear. There isn't a corporate filter to everything that we have access to. And that has been huge for something like the Palestinian rights movement. You know, when I think about this latest assault on Gaza and Jerusalem, when you look at the footage of Israeli soldiers brutalizing unarmed Palestinian demonstrators, breaking into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, beating up people inside, some people who were already in handcuffs when they were being beaten, that footage should have been breaking news on every news outlet, and it was not. But people still saw it because it was coming through on social media. And that is absolutely a huge part of the shift in discourse that we're seeing. And I think that it does ultimately have an effect in the way corporate media operates. It does not completely open the door for our narrative to be, you know, the mainstream narrative, so to speak, but at least present. There is that pressure that when you have so many people feeling a certain way, you have so many now voices within mainstream media, voices like Mehdi Hassan and Ayman Muhyiddin and Ali Velchi, all of them at MSNBC, being outspoken on this issue and just covering it honestly and correctly. That obviously creates a little bit more pressure, where we see that coverage is shifting in a positive direction. We see that there are more Palestinian voices now being invited on to share their perspective. The narrative still remains deeply problematic and falls drastically short of where it needs to be, but it is better than it was. And I think with continued progress in the flow of information, accurate information about what is unfolding, I think it only gets better and better, which is why the problem of censorship that is happening on Facebook and Instagram and elsewhere is a serious one, because that is essentially the outlet in which we share our voices directly. And the fact that you have this trend right now of so many outlets that are, so many, you know, posts that are showing the reality of what's unfolding in Palestine being censored and being taken down is a very, very serious problem. And the fact that you have somebody on the Facebook censorship board, essentially the people who get to decide what content is allowed and what's not, including somebody who worked with the Israeli government in the past, specifically to censor and monitor Palestinian content, really is a deeply troubling reality that we should be demanding a change on. We can't, it's simply unacceptable for us to continue existing in this situation in which our content occasionally gets viewed when we're sharing it directly through ourselves. This is just another form of the suppression of the flow of accurate information about what's happening in Palestine. I see it as a part of the effort to expand the definition of anti-Semitism, to include criticism of Israel, to conflate these things to suppress speech on this issue. And I also see it as part of the effort to suppress BDS, to say that engaging in boycotts of Israel somehow can be punishable by the government, which are laws that have passed to that effect in so many different states. This is ultimately all part of a coordinated effort to suppress Palestinian voices. And I think that that is really where the fight is at right now. The opponents cannot win the arguments on merit anymore. They have lost the debate. The reality of the ugliness, the ugly face of Israeli apartheid is now on full display. And the only way the other side can fight is by trying to suppress us from being able to speak altogether. And that's why this fight is so important.
You know, I really I find it rather troubling when you know, some members of Congress, you know, that don't want to co-sponsor 2590, and my response is always, you can actually still be a Zionist and hold dear your, you know, Israeli security concerns or whatever two-state solution, whatever positions that you want to hold, because it's very minimalist in nature. You know, it just says stop doing further things. You know, don't further demolish homes, don't further annex territory. So it's not saying roll back everything that you've done and give it all up. So I just find it rather troubling that that's the case. Now we've spoken a lot about hope and and seeing this tide shifting and how we can take it forward. But another reality that's possible is Republicans can take back Congress. So if that does happen, what does that do to our activism and how we strategize in our activism? What do you say to that if that does happen? Because anything is possible. Beth?
Anything's possible. This is definitely possible. All of this could definitely be reversed, right? We've talked a lot about hope, but I think we should be ending on determination.
Positive note.
Yeah, I think that we need to end on the understanding that this we are not there yet, right? We're gaining steam quickly. We're gaining steam, and that can halt and that can reverse. And Republicans taking back Congress could absolutely be a part of that. Which is why this is not a moment to lean back and say, wow, like look at what we've done, right? It's a moment to double down and organize harder than ever. If you are not calling your member of Congress and both of your senators like once a week, kick it into gear. Start doing it, right? Because those other groups these anti-Palestinian groups Congress is hearing from them all the time, and they need to be hearing from us constantly as well. And so, if it happens that Republicans get a majority in Congress, I mean, the truth is that it doesn't change what we do, right? We keep fighting just as hard. We've done it before under Republican-controlled Congresses, and we will do it again, probably at some point. And we'll keep pushing really, really hard. And the way that we approach a lot of our advocacy right now, because the truth is that the bills we push forward are unlikely to be brought for a vote, right? We don't have Democratic leadership that will bring these bills to a vote. Pelosi doesn't want to do it. Hoyer doesn't want to do it. So already a lot of the work we're doing, like the path to getting there is just as important as like actually if it'll get a vote, because the path to getting there creates a vehicle for all of us to be heard in DC, right? It's a reason to be calling your member of Congress. It's a reason to be protesting outside of their offices or sitting in at their offices. It's a reason to be demanding more of your senators and increasing that pressure, right? Jewish Voice for Peace just had our advocacy days a couple weeks ago at the beginning of June. And one thing we heard from staffers and from members of Congress in the Senate and in the House across the board, even if they were totally in opposition to what we were saying, is that they had been hearing from us. And by us, I mean the movement, right? They were like, yeah, the last few weeks, our phones have been ringing off the hook with people wanting to talk about Palestine. And that matters. And so if it's a Republican-controlled Congress, if it's a Democratic-controlled Congress, that piece has to stay the same. We have to be demanding that our voices be heard. And it can look very, very different depending on who your representatives are, right? It doesn't have to be a polite sit-down meeting with them. It could be a protest. It could be like that. It can be engaging them in media or publicly at town halls or things like that. But it needs to stay and grow. And that is no matter who is in control of Congress, because that is really important to be building that political power down the line.
Thank you.
And it shifts the political calculus.
Thank you so much for that positive note. Omar, I'm going to let you conclude us on a positive note. Keep it positive.
We'll try to. Look, honestly, I really think that there's every reason to be hopeful at this moment in a way that was, to be frank, surprising to me. When Israel started bombing Gaza after the violence in Jerusalem and after the mobs in 48 and all of that, I wasn't sure that this was not going to go the way it did in 2014. I was expecting, especially with the Biden administration in power, I was expecting the same, especially when the nonsense was exactly what we expected at the very beginning of Israel's defending itself and isn't doing anything wrong and all of that. I was worried that we're in for a lengthy bombing campaign that would kill thousands of people and that there would not be any meaningful opposition. And I was very pleasantly surprised to see that that's not how it went at all. I was pleasantly surprised by the number of celebrities who were outspoken on this. I mean, people that you see on your TV and in movies all the time are suddenly tweeting Free Palestine and talking about Israeli apartheid. That really is unprecedented. To turn on C-SPAN and watch that people are taken to the House floor to denounce Israeli apartheid is unprecedented. The extent of it has really been incredibly empowering. And witnessing that discourse and witnessing the pressure that was built and seeing that Israel came under pressure to conclude this, I mean, obviously, it can never be concluded early enough. Every single Palestinian death and every single bomb that is dropped is an injustice that is utterly intolerable. But it's important to be mindful of the progress that is being made, and the fact that I think that right now Israeli leaders are very aware of it. They're aware of the fact that things are changing. They view it as a threat. The organizations that are apologists for Israeli apartheid in the United States, the biggest ones, see the shifting discourse as a threat. They talk about it. They see that things are changing. And I think that when we see them looking at our power and shaking because of it, that should be an incredibly empowering moment for us to really look at ourselves, to realize our power, and to move forward ahead, to do it cautiously, to do it strategically, to do it intelligently, but to also do it relentlessly, because I really think that victory is within reach. And it's a cause that any person who understands it, the second that your average American understands exactly what is happening in Palestine, I have no doubt that you can turn just about anybody in the American population into an advocate for justice and American foreign policy. It's an incredibly powerful issue that really speaks for itself. So I'm incredibly powerful. And thank you, Tarek, and thank you, Beth. Honestly, with people like you in this fight, I think that we're making tremendous progress, and I feel hopeful about where we're heading. And
I do as well. And I really do appreciate both of your contributions and the work that you do. Omar, your videos are phenomenal. Beth, your activism is outside of this world, and I learned so much from both of you. And I really hope that we can keep the momentum going, and hopefully we'll get more co-sponsors to HR 2590 just from this webinar alone. So let's just hope and pray for a free Palestine. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much.